Hello all, Rick here with a video on a topic which I have covered in bits and pieces throughout other videos. The Warp 5 speed limit that was imposed on Starfleet is one of those things that comes up from time to time in a number of other topics, but it occurs to me I've yet to consolidate the lore into one video, and I can't just recommend viewers that want a topic covered go digging through 6 others on my channel just to piece it together, so here it is. What happened to the warp speed limit and the damage to subspace? Setting the scene. In 2370, the United Federation of Planets was made aware of the damage to subspace caused by frequent warp travel. While much research had been conducted on the topic before, ultimately Starfleet had reached the consensus that such damage was non-existent, and that warp posed no real detriment to subspace itself. After all, it had been using warp for 3 centuries already with no ill effects. But this changed in the Hecarus corridor. This area of space was flush with Tetryon radiation, which prevented warp travel anywhere except through a narrow stretch of space near the Hecarus system. Because of this, many species utilised the corridor at warp, creating a warm area of space-time with cumulative use. So, the effects of warp travel were amplified here, making the effects of prolonged usage visible within a lifetime instead of over centuries. The effects were being felt on Hecarus 2, the inhabited nearby world, as gravitational changes originating from subspace were affecting the planet. But the research and theoretical models that illustrated the points were incredibly complex and hard to convey, so Ramal and Serova, sibling subspace scientists, resorted to extreme activism to bring the issue to light. Eventually, after their findings were corroborated, Starfleet immediately took measures to prevent further damage to subspace by imposing a drastic speed limit on warp, limiting all vessels to a maximum of warp 5. To give you a notion of how detrimental this was to space travel, warp 5 is a whole factor below the Enterprise D's average cruising speed. This research was shared with the Klingon Empire, which surprisingly accepted the results and agreed to abide by the recommended speed limit, while the Romulan Star Empire denied this. The data was then shared among all other warp-faring species, but it would be up to each government to choose how to uphold this new information or even act on it. However, this speed limit was something that was seemingly forgotten in Star Trek Moving On. But was it? This occurred in the last season of TNG, specifically episode 9, so any episodes after the stardate of 47310.2 would have to theoretically abide by this change. Out of those episodes, the Enterprise does exceed this limit several times, but only in emergencies or on the direct orders from Starfleet. Parallels sees Picard order a maximum speed warp jump, but they were under fire at the time. The next episode is Pegasus, where a verbal confirmation is given that they are allowed to exceed the warp limit for the duration of the mission to recover the classified USS Pegasus. Homeward sees the Enterprise transporting a Boralan populace to a new home at maximum warp, but they were under time constraints. The episode Lower Decks then sees them gain permission to break the warp limit for their missions, as the following episode 18, Eye of the Beholder, also allows for this. Finally, in episode 22, the Enterprise makes speed to the Kamor system, but only at warp 5, despite a life potentially being on the line. So, at least in TNG, it wasn't completely abandoned. Now, in real life, the reasoning for it being pushed aside is simple. It was proving to be too much of a hindrance to the plot, and the message of environmental damage was already apparent and clear to audiences in TNG from the episode Force of Nature. In universe, however, it's not really mentioned again, with the USS Voyager consistently cruising across the whole Milky Way at very high warp speeds, and the Dominion War making no mention of sticking to the speed limitations during wartime, or exceeding them even. However, there is extensive apocrypha and lore added to the shows through other context that provides explanations as to this warp 5 limit and how Starfleet tackled it. Essentially, they did not ignore the issue, holding its solving in the highest priority. It's also worth mentioning that in the episode 20 of Series 7 of TNG, Wesley Crusher mentions that a Dr. Vastbinder has recently published new papers on warp propulsion that renders a lot of LaForge's improvements obsolete, so this might be relevant to overcoming the subspace damage issues. One of the first things that Starfleet did was order a fleet-wide analysis of all their ships' warp systems to see which ones were most likely to cause the most damage. Thankfully, although Starfleet has a preferred warp system, they constantly innovate in new designs, seldom repeating what they have done before. Every new ship design had to have a reason to distinguish it, or they'd just maintain older ships, like the Excelsior. Some of these changes were going to be trialling new engine layouts, nacelle positioning, and so on. They found that ships with a narrower subspace profile did far less damage to space than things like the Galaxy class, which basically brute forced its way across space-time. Classes like the Challenger were found to be very environmentally friendly with their implementation of subspace field boosters, and this was carried over into most new models, the Defiant being one example. As for the Intrepid class Voyager, the design was already nearing completion, and this was a last-minute hurdle thrown into the plans to launch it until the variable warp geometry was added to the nacelle pylons, allowing them to pivot into a smarter system that manipulated the warp field on the fly to let it slip through subspace without causing much turbulence. Not usable on every design, this nonetheless proved to be a boon for the Intrepid class, which, thanks to its bio-neural circuitry, was, air quotes, smart enough to manage the system. From then on, we do enter the Dominion War era ships, which are far narrower in profile for two reasons. The first is that Starfleet was moving into an era where it expected more combat, and so newer vessels had lower target profiles. But that's not as effective in space when you can attack from more than a horizontal plane. The second reason was that a thinner ship meant that you could generate a narrower subspace field, which was more aerodynamic. I hesitate to use that word for space travel for obvious reasons. But when it comes to subspace dynamics are totally a thing, as is turbulence, so creating an efficient design is key. This led to the sleeker, cutting profiles of the Akira, Sovereign class, and so on, which seemed to never adhere to the warp speed limit. This insinuates that by 2371, which is when we see the building of the first Akira-class vessels, Starfleet was already well on its way to creating workarounds by minimalising their damage. As for other vessels like the Galaxy class and the age-old Excelsior, well, consider that the end of TNG and the following 5 years of the Dominion War, well, we see the lessening of those ships and the proliferation of the newer designs, and it's safe to say that those vessels were being retired. The Galaxy class was expected to be the prestige ship of Starfleet's for a long time, but despite this, we see it dropped in favour of the Sovereign, and by the turn of the 25th century, there are no such ships left in service. It's probable, therefore, that as much was done as possible to improve the warp systems of older vessels, but overall, it was not enough to keep them up to par with newer designs. Add to this the new influx of technology and information derived in the face of the war and Voyager's journey, and suddenly you have multiple excuses to reinvent your entire fleet. Even the Romulans began to slim down their ships, with their trademarked Deredex being replaced with the slimmer Valdor or Mogai class as their standard warbird by 2379. So, putting all this together, the timeline sorta looks something like this. 2370 sees the proof of environmental damage to subspace sent to the Federation. The UFP implements a speed limit of Warp 5 save for emergencies, designates unstable zones as necessary travel only, and shares its findings with everyone who has access to warp travel. Then they prioritise new fields of subspace study and ways to improve their warp designs by firstly looking into and evaluating all their ships, discovering some key features to minimalise the subspace damage, and all of this within a month or so of the discovery. The Intrepid design and others are put on hold until a workaround can be discovered, and it's soon established that there are new subspace field layouts that can mitigate the damage. By 2371, these alterations are implemented onto existing ships, which lessens the issue, but some vessels are just not designed to optimise these adaptations. Construction resumes on the Intrepid class with its variable warp geometry. Other systems like subspace amplifiers and repeaters installed throughout a ship are also effective at reducing the damage to negligible amounts, so all newer ships are designed with narrower subspace profiles and these systems in place. By 2373, the Sovereign class emerges as a ship that has overcome these issues, and for Starfleet the problem is almost a thing of the past. However, older ships still exist, for whom upgrading and overhauls are not likely. Unfortunately, the Dominion War prevents a large-scale decommissioning of the fleet, so that will have to wait until 2375 when the war ends. It's likely that for the duration of the war, the warp limit was lifted. Ships that do not conform to these new Starfleet warp systems are eventually decommissioned, and by 2379, most of Starfleet is no longer affected by this issue. Although it should be noted that ships do maintain lower cruising speeds when it's not needed, even though they are capable of higher. By 2380, it's a non-issue, with a combination of newer designs, subspace profiles, and modifications to how the engines run, allowing Starfleet to continue to innovate forwards with new systems. By 2401, Warp 9.99 is an easily achievable speed, and cruising speeds are much higher, showing that whatever changes Starfleet has been making have worked, and that there is no longer a limit imposed so long as the warp systems are advanced enough. As a final note, considering the openness of the Federation when it was first made aware of the issue, I suspect that they would have openly shared select research with other powers, without revealing their experimental engine designs and the like. The knowledge that minimalising subspace profiles was key, the idea of variable warp geometry, the usage of subspace repeaters and so on would likely be shared with all other powers, as it's a universal affair, and considering the change we see in even the Romulans' approach to design, I think most seem to have listened. Imagine that. So, what do you think of the warp limit and how quickly it was brushed aside? For myself, I liked the topic that they tackled, but the fact that they made warp the factor was kind of too much of a blow, and it did not work out, considering many other intergalactic powers outside of Starfleet, even many who predate them, used warp drive for centuries, and only now are we seeing the effects? And if they were going to make such a drastic change to Starfleet, well then they should have stuck to their guns and made it as impactful as such a repercussion should have been. Instead, the very next series that came along decided that Starfleet had solved it off screen because it would hinder the entire premise of the show, if the issues were allowed to persist. But fixing, forgetting or changing tech off screen is hardly a unique experience for Trek. Thanks for watching this breakdown on the Law of the Warp 5 speed limit. I've been Rick, and I'll see you later. Thanks again, and goodbye.